Started for today. You have the page here. I'm just going to briefly talk about myself so you get a little bit about my background. I'm not going to go read this or go through every detail, but basically I'm a senior executive. I've been in senior executive roles in various companies for over 30 years. Companies such as Colgate Palmolive, Mars, Rickett and Benckiser. And then when I decided to take on a second career, I became a professor at Rutgers Business School. Just as a note, when I was at Colgate, I was Vice President, Chief Procurement Officer, and during my tenure, I completed a 4-year global procurement transformation with savings in excess of $1 billion. I'm going to talk a little bit about ProcureTrain here. I'm also a managing director for ProcureTrain. This is a digital learning platform for procurement professionals. We think it's unique. It has very high quality content taught by subject matter experts, senior people in business. It's a web-based, subscription-based system where you have 24/7 access to the videos that we put on there. And we do some things unique, such as allow people to ask questions during or after the video, and also one-to-one coaching. So it's something, if you get a minute, take a look at. It's a little bit of a different way of training. We think it's somewhat unique. You can make your own judgment on that. So let's go ahead and get started. Before we do, we want to just mention that Zycus has a big conference coming up in the end of October, the 28th and 30th. This is going to be in Lansdowne Resort and Spa in Leesburg, Virginia. This is about where procurement intellect meets digital technology. So I would encourage you to register for this. They have many large companies that are there, such as Amway, Coca-Cola, Mondelez, Home Depot. They also have some of the research companies such as Gartner and Spend Manners and others. So you'll get a good mix of both, having excellent presenters as well as companies you can network with. So I would certainly encourage you to come to this conference. And we're going to talk a little bit about digital technology today, where it's useful and how it can be used. So I think it's a very timely issue. It's in a lot of the current discussions about procurement. Okay, so let's just walk through what we're going to do first in today's office hours. First, I'm going to talk a little bit about the format for office hours. Then we're going to talk about why are you even talking about this particular issue about balancing performance and risk in a robust supply chain. Then we'll get into the frequently asked questions. I'll talk about that, and then in the last page you'll have contact information. So let's take the first one here. The office hours format for the participants today, it's a little bit different. This isn't just meant to be a presentation style format. This is really like almost like you'd go in and have office hours with a professor and you can ask questions. So many of you have submitted very good questions, which we'll go through today, and briefly have some bullet points, but obviously I'll be talking about them. You also, if you want, can ask a question by putting your question in the chat box. I'm sure many of you have been involved in these type of webinars. You know how to do that. And then lastly, the last page that you'll see in the deck here will have emails for both Zycus and myself. And you can get, if you have any questions about what I've talked about or presented today, you can send emails to either one of us. So one of the things is, why are we talking about this? And this came from a report that Zycus sponsored in 2017. And it says, what are some of the top opportunities for improvement of procurement processes? And you can see here that there are many reasons. The first three are, cost, obviously, is always important with supplier negotiations, spend, visibility, and then ease of getting information. All these things are things that process automation can help you. And it's very important in today's discussion, because you'll hear me talk about it, is that by making your processes more efficient and effective, you can spend time where you should be spending time, such as supplier performance and risk management. one solution before we get into it around procurement automation, and we'll echo this on and off during the discussion today, but you've heard some of these words before, but things such as RPA, which is robotics process automation, you're familiar with these things. These are things like P2P, or some people call it sourced to settle, certainly using e-invoices to make you more efficient. The second one is starting to come into vogue today about artificial intelligence, where you can take this information and it will categorize the information into various categories like PO information, invoice information. It can also help guide requisitioners to category-specific buys. And the last one, which is fairly new, but it's probably the next stage that you would probably think about, which is machine learning. And this is actually where, if you think about it from the idea that somebody would build algorithms and things almost like a robot that would be able to, quite frankly, do part of our jobs, right? And this is coming in now. It's not going to come overnight, but you can imagine where this could help you make a lot of decisions, making sure suppliers are financially viable, or potentially maybe even help you negotiate better. One study that I read said that by automating these types of processes, you can save 3 to 4% of your overall spend. So let's say that you have a $2 billion external spend, maybe direct and indirects, that would relate to $60 to $70 million. So keep that in the back of your mind. I know you probably don't need another cost goal, but if you think about it, very little percentage of savings can generate enough money to justify procurement automation. So let's go ahead and get started. We have a couple categories here. We've tried to put the first category is around kind of supplier performance, which is one of the themes of this particular office hour. And so let's go ahead and get started. We actually had 2 questions that were submitted in advance, and they were somewhat related, so I'm going to read both of them to you. The first one is, what are KPIs, key performance indicators, for measuring supplier performance, and how do I deal with high and low performing suppliers? A related question, which we'll also address under Q1 here, is what type of analytics are considered to be crucial in evaluating supplier base, and how appropriately to assess the size, quantity, and quality of suppliers. We linked these 2 together because we thought they're somewhat related, so we're going to probably tackle them in the next couple of slides. The first part around KPIs is that they have to be both quantitative and qualitative. So I know you're very familiar with the quantitative ones. These would be the typical ones that you're familiar with, such as on-time delivery, quality, maybe parts per million, rejects or waivers, those types of things. Price might be a comparison of price. There's ways to evaluate price, or maybe even cost reduction. Those are pretty standard. Many of those can be directly in your ERP system and come right off your ERP system, and then it can be put into some sort of balanced scorecard. The qualitative ones are more ones where you're asking people questions about how well is this supplier doing for you. So examples of qualitative ones would be things like, how well do they resolve problems? What kind of technical support do they give that we need? How about new product development? These are generally done with some sort of just a monkey type survey, so you can send it out to the stakeholders in the business and say, how is the supplier doing? So for example, if you're dealing with a supplier, a manufacturing supplier, and he needs to help you with a lot of technical issues, you might ask somebody in manufacturing and engineering to say, hey, how's the supplier doing supporting us on a technical resolution type of basis? So I think you need both quantitative and qualitative to be effective. We'll talk a little bit about how many you need, but basically I think you got to have both. I think you got to segment your suppliers. You can't treat them all the same. And what I mean by that, you don't want to have, somebody like office supplies. You probably don't care about, problem resolution. What you really care about is to deliver the stuff on time and complete. Whereas maybe your strategic supplier, you're going to want to obviously track them in price, quality, and service, but in addition to that, you want to know about maybe new product development. So I think one size doesn't fit all. and I think you need to think about, having different levels of supplier scorecarding for different types of suppliers. One thing that's very popular today is using supplier portals to speed communication. So if you put this information out there, your supplier can get that 24/7. So he'll know how well he's doing in all these quantitative and qualitative KPIs. And he can self-adjust and make changes. And some people actually show the supplier's ratings, and then they have a conglomerate of other suppliers in that category. Now, that's pretty motivational if he's looking to say, I'm delivering on time at 90%, but the category people are delivering at 98. It's going to be self-motivated to fix that problem. So that's a good tool to use. And then I think this idea of regular performance reviews, particularly with your large suppliers. We typically meet with our suppliers on a regular basis. I believe it's got to be a little more formal. And particularly with the large suppliers come in, or with any supplier come in, you ought to be able to pull this data up. For example, Colgate, we used to pull this stuff up on a screen in an office or a conference room and be able to show some of these scorecards directly to the supplier so he can see them real time. But in any case, if you do have regular performance reviews, I believe particularly for large suppliers, you got to have written action plans and follow up. And I think that's a good way to motivate suppliers, knowing that you're having written action plans and the next time or whatever time period you're going to follow up. I think you know the KISS method, which is keep it simple, stupid. Just jokingly about this, but you can only handle so much data. So again, coming back to the segment idea, keep it simple. I think if you're going to track 15 KPIs, it's probably too many. You've got to put the right KPIs, what you need, depending on the supplier. And you can segment your suppliers to keep it easy, but you should really think about it. And if you're going to track, 15 KPIs, which I personally think are, generally too many, but having said it, I think you got to keep it to ones that are really important to you and the supplier and the business. And lastly, there are many suppliers that have software out there that can help. You can look at Zycus as iPerform, for example, can help track this data. So you can literally use software to make this a lot easier both for yourself as well as the supplier. Okay, moving on. This is really kind of the second question, about the analytics, about looking at your supply base. You probably know all these terms, but just for maybe some of the participants that haven't thought about it, one simple way to start evaluating your suppliers is to do a Pareto analysis, where you have the largest spend to the least spend. We know from experience that on the direct materials, generally 20% of your suppliers equal 80% of your volume. Indirects is probably less than that. It's probably something like 20% is 60% of your spend. But the point would be, you should know who your largest suppliers are. And that's one way to segment your suppliers, and particularly when you're thinking about the previous slide about, what do you track? Usually your largest suppliers will have more qualitative and quantitative KPIs. The second one, which is probably key, is that if you have good, what I call supplier relationship management data or performance data, you can look at this data and say that, how well are these suppliers performing? I would caution you not to do it in general. I would do it by category, because I think it's fair to compare categories. So if it's all corrugated box suppliers, you compare all corrugated box, or you compare all packaging people, in one category, and that'll help you determine who should be in your base. If you have somebody that's not performing over a long period of time and you've given them written notices and they haven't responded, it's a good candidate to discontinue that supplier. Conversely, if you have a good supplier that is quite frankly doing quite well, you might want to give him some more business. The third bullet is very common. We teach this in all business schools across the world, is a SWOT analysis. It's very well known. You've probably heard of it before. Strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats. Very common. It's been around since the 80s, but I would suggest it works very well with evaluating suppliers. And I would also suggest that you have your stakeholders in the room and show them in the 2x2, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, and threats, and they may have some input for you. You in procurement might think this particular supplier has certain strengths, whereas maybe the stakeholder says, I don't think he has those strengths, that's a weakness. By having the interchange with the stakeholders in the business, I think it can be very useful to evaluating your supply base. The last one, which we use quite frequently at Colgate, and I've seen it used elsewhere, is Krajcik Matrix. This has been around since the 80s. This is the one, as you probably know, where you have risks on one side of the chart and value, how much value you can get out of it. The 4 boxes you know very well is one is routine. Those are things like office supplies. You know, you're not going to spend a lot of time in those. Your leverage are the ones you have good specifications that you competitively bid. You have your strategic suppliers in the upper right-hand corner, and then you have basically bottlenecks where you only maybe have one supplier and can't change. So what's important about that is that when you're evaluating suppliers, that if you know what category they're in, you can make an evaluation how well they're doing. So if they are strategic, for example, are they acting strategically? Do the KPIs make you confirm that they're strategic, right? You know, for me, as a strategic supplier, it's a given he's going to have good price, quality, and service. It's not what he has to prove himself probably in the softer areas, such as new product development. So anyway, it's a good way to do it, and again, I would recommend that you have your stakeholders in the business where they can also give input into it. It's a very useful tool. Okay. Moving on to question 2. I understand how to measure cost, delivery, quality, but many times I struggle to measure value. Any suggestions? This question comes up all the time. What I would say to people, I'll just give you some examples to think about, but it can be done. And you know, one area which I think is many times people put in the too hard bucket is the area of supplier innovation. And I would contend to you that there's many ways to do this. You could have some sort of how many ideas the supplier has turned into the business and how many of those have been actually taken and converted into an actual idea and accepted. You can have things such as if you use stage gate performance method to evaluate new product introduction, if the supplier, how many times does he hit the ramp up on his side? How about sales and how about revenue? So an example of Colgate would be our fragrance and flavor supplier one time from Russia came to us and said, you know, Russians really are enthralled and really are interested in beeswax and all sorts of things. Why don't you try to put beeswax into a toothpaste? Now, we wouldn't have thought of that sitting in New York, you know, research and development. So the supplier got the idea, and we put it in. It was very successful because, for whatever reason, the people in Russia, you know, think that beeswax is important. It wouldn't be my first choice to put in toothpaste, but having said it, I think wouldn't you want to track that to say we brought that idea in from suppliers and we generated 100,000 or 300,000 or 3 million in sales. And if you could do that with various items, I think it shows that you're creating value and helping the sales. What about helping the company launch into a new region? We support that, right, with new suppliers and you know, and help manufacturing get those suppliers. There's no reason you couldn't attract those revenues. So while it isn't perfect, I think just by having the discussion around it, I think it's something that could be done. Other than supplier innovation, there's plenty of others here I've listed here. One of them is quality improvement. If we generate, let's say, less defects, that would reduce manufacturing costs. We should get credit for that. Suppose those quality improvements basically reduce customer returns or maybe warranty costs. Shouldn't we track that? Cash is king in corporations today. We've had many ways, such as extended payment terms that are reducing inventory, that we would get additional cash to the business. We at Colgate were very successful at supplier managed inventory, where the supplier managed the inventory until the point that you turned it into a finished goods. So those SMI, supplier managed inventory, the cash savings that we reduced inventory, we took it as it took inventory carrying costs and it took credit in that for savings. So you could keep track of cash savings that you've done through various methods. Many companies today are you know, tracking things such as, I've put broad brush statements here, but ethical sourcing or social responsibility, Many companies are looking at things such as sustainability ratings. Walmart is rating many of their suppliers here in this country and around the world and how they look at their sustainability. If those ratings are important, you should highlight those. Those are part of your suppliers. And lastly, risk management. We don't have time today in today's office hours, but there are ways to evaluate risk in the array of ratings. And that is another tool that you want to do it. So I guess what I would just say here in general is that there are a lot of other things other than just savings. Third question is, how does the supplier management automation help boost performance, and how do I get buy-in? Well, just a quick chart here about self-service we mentioned a little bit earlier. This is where you have a porthole and people go in there, and this shows that 80% of organizations reported improved supplier relations offering this management tool. So it's just one example. Again, this is from a Zycus type supported thing, but just by having that, it's one way to show that you're creating, making things easier, more efficient and effective. So, you know, coming around to this, that this is really about supplier making your overall process more efficient and effective. If you think about it, if you have these types of process improvements, you're going to not only have better data, but you're going to have actionable data. And you're going to be able to spend more time evaluating the data and getting better KPIs, thereby helping the business. So, you know, my recommendation here is to, you know, really start with your senior management. So in the question that says, well, how do you get people involved? Ask your senior management outside of procurement, you know, what they're looking for. I think you'd be surprised. Yes, they're going to have cost savings, that's true, but they're going to want other things, right? So you want to find out. They might say, geez, it would be great if a manufacturing guy might say get better delivery, or a research and development person might want, you know, more help on the technical side. So find out what it is, and then you can look at, you know, using performance metrics about where you are today, and then potentially where you're going to be, right? And by setting those up, I think managers say, yes, those are good things to work on. And then, as I mentioned earlier, because we have such large expenditures under our responsibility, anytime you take any small percentage, it's a big number. And I'll tell you to the people that are on the thing that basically, that if you take 3 to 4%, as I said earlier, or 1 to 2%, it's a lot of money, and it will be able to justify putting money into systems like this. Okay, we're going to move on to a couple of questions that were submitted on supplier risk. The first one, question 4, is what are some early symptoms of poor supplier risk management, and how can I highlight these internally? I think I'm going to back up on this one a little bit. I think it's important to get ahead of this. And what do I mean by that? So how do I highlight them and see what they are? This really starts with many of you on the call today. You have some sort of strategic sourcing process, 5 to 7 steps or whatever. And usually in those things, or if it's not there, you should have it. You have some sort of a supplier category reviews, and in there you have some sort of identification of potential risk. And if you do, I think you must have, at least we did in our organizations I work for, some sort of written contingency plan. And the reason I bring this up is that how do you highlight it? If you do that and you basically have some methodology to say these are the high-risk suppliers, then you can go to your senior management. At Colgate, we used to do this on a monthly basis and have some sort of cross-functional risk management group look at these risks. And then you're highlighting this in advance and say what are your contingency plans around it and what's your progress against those contingency plans. So to me, it starts way back in the strategic sourcing process about how to get highlighted for these types of things. On an ongoing basis, which is slightly different, and many of these are the suppliers we talked about earlier, from routine to the leverage suppliers, the big suppliers, maybe strategic, you have these balanced scorecards. Again, we talked about this, quantitative and qualitative. You will analyze it, as I said earlier, by category and grouping. I think it's more powerful than just having one number for all different types of suppliers. Quite frankly, many suppliers are very different than others. And then you want to review and monitor those exceptions. And many of these systems today will set out and say, here are some exceptions that you need to look at. He's not delivering on time. He's having some additional quality problems. And so I think by doing it on an exception basis, it allows you to focus on those ones. If you just have all the data coming at you, or you got to go through reams and reams of paper and or computer screens, it's going to be very cumbersome to get it done. So many of these software packages have this kind of capability to help you out. The fifth question is about how much supplier risk am I liable for? I think the word not to is, I think it's for, with poor or no automation. Can you give me some examples? This is a tough one to quantify, right? But what do we know, right? I mean, it's a tough question, to be honest with you. I'll give you an example, a couple of examples in a minute, but we know that when we have major supplier disruptions, and hopefully you haven't had many of these in your career, we know that these create major cost of business. A simple example would be that if a supplier's had some sort of problems, quality or manufacturing problems, you got to air freight stuff in, and that costs a lot of money, right? So there's a lot of cost, and it can really accumulate very quickly. Worse than that, suppose that you have to have lost revenue. You have to go talk to your senior management and sales saying, I can't get this product because of the stuff that I ordered did not come in, blah, blah, blah. Certainly can have, as a result of lost revenue or just having any bad quality, you can have customer service issues. And I'm sure you're aware that if you have customer service issues, you can have loyalty issues. And the reason that's important, that if you lose the loyalty of your customers, they're very hard to win back. There's something like a number to say it's 10 times harder to get a customer that left back than a new customer. So when you lose them for good. Reputation. If you have a supplier disruption or problem in the field, think of the company reputation. If you don't believe me, just take a look at, read the newspaper every day. Their companies get all sorts of problems. I think of something like a factory that would have child labor in it, like, God forbid, right? I mean, it could literally, get in the newspaper and have a picture of a kid that's working at a machine in some Asian country, for example. Ruin the reputation of a company. It's happened before. You can ask Nike about their problems years and years ago. Shareholder value. Typically when you have problems, you literally have shareholder value loss. A good example would be British BP in the Gulf incidents where the oil well in the Gulf of Mexico leaked, right? Not only did it cost them $30 billion, I think they're still in the courts over it here in the United States. In addition to that, they had tremendous shareholder loss of value. People didn't believe that this was going to be good for them, and that hurt everybody in the company and all the shareholders. So these kind of disruptions can cost a lot of money, and it can also create shareholder value loss. And lastly, not to be joking, but you have problems and they don't get fixed. It's not really good for your career, right? But so it is important. So one example I'd give it's fairly public, so it's a good one. You may have seen this. You can get it, I'm sure, from IBM. But IBM, of course, has a lot of risk management tools available to them. They market themselves in this particular area. But they always tell the story whenever they're presenting about the tsunami that came into Thailand. You might remember the story a few years ago, and it wiped out a lot of the hard drive and computer components in this particular area in Thailand. And many, many people got shorted those things for a fairly long period of time. To be honest with you, that they saw that coming because they had weather information. They saw it long in advance. They were able to build up inventories and get them out of there in advance. And they also were able to basically not shut down any of their facilities, whereas other people didn't react as quickly. And they had contingency plans in place, et cetera, et cetera. and they basically ended up not getting hurt too bad from that particular problem. Other people did, as you know, might want to went on some period of time. So that's an example where, by not having good automated systems, come back to the question, you can miss those types of problems and end up basically being shut out of supply. Question 6 is also a good question. It's about how can I take my organization to a position where it's capable of tackling incoming risks. And I think part of this is the idea that, that how do you get the whole organization behind you? This is where I think the procurement people have to take their buying hat off and put their selling hat on. Something that procurement people aren't particularly good at, but we need to be better salesmen within the company. And I would say by going out to people in the company and telling them that you have processes and procedures and things, and we need to make sure that we put a focus on this, sell senior management on the concept so people understand why you're doing it. And you as a procurement professional, you should have real life examples, hopefully, not hopefully, but maybe from your own company, that you could say, remember when this happened, right? And, we got hurt for a while, we can't let that happen again, and these are the reasons that we need risk management policies and procedures, and we need to have, strategies around risk management. You can also get examples from outside your company. I would suggest to you that if you're on the internet or you're reading newspapers, whenever you see one of these stories, print it out, put it in a file, and then use those as examples. The third thing I think to get your organization focused in on it, it can be very helpful, is talk to your insurance people, the risk management people. They're experts in this. They see more problems than anybody else within your company. Because remember, these things don't happen very frequently, so people kind of forget and lose focus. But your risk management insurance people have lots of examples. I know a lot of times procurement people are sensitive not having somebody looking over their shoulder in this area, but I can tell you that more often than not, they have a different set of eyes on the problem, and they can help sell this internally also. And then lastly, when you do have a success where something comes together, that you highlight the successes then when they occurred. There was a story a while back where they had Hurricane Katrina that came through the New Orleans area. It wiped out a lot of factories down there, and there was a group of my Colgate people that worked successfully with the strategy around risk management. They ended up, to make a long story short, not shutting any of our factories down, and they actually got a big award at the annual shareholders meeting. It's called Chairman You Can Make a Difference Award, to be able to show their successes. And you want to remind people of those types of successes that occur. So I think if you do this, you can get your organization focused on it. But the bottom line for me is that we as procurement people need to be better salesmen, and particularly in these type of issues, if we believe this is the right way to go. Okay. The last couple sets of questions about business growth with respect to suppliers. So question 7 is I'll just read it again, is we continually expand our global sourcing. It's difficult to get travel dollars and time, and to manage these suppliers from a risk and a supplier development / performance standpoint. What can we do to improve the situation? This is very common, particularly during the recession 2008. A lot of companies cut back on travel for obvious reasons. I think, we had to somewhat work our way back. But a couple of things I think that would be helpful here. I think the first one is that, we have to realize, whether we like it or not, that our management will hold us accountable for cost savings. Now, why am I bringing that up here? Well, because I think we have to deliver on cost savings to open the door or get a seat at the table for the value. So assuming we do that, you have your COO or your CFO or come up to you and say, hey, John or Mary, how are you doing on those cost savings? And you want to say, hey, look, we're on track to save $1 million this year. It's looking real good. I feel really positive about it. By the way, let me tell you about some other value that we created for the business. And I think that has to be something to remember. We easily talk about cost savings with senior management. We sometimes forget to talk about other value we create. We already went on through this earlier, but you know, as an example, you know, we talked earlier, we reduced risk to the business. We're spending more time focusing on it. We don't want you to end up on the front page of the, you know, the Wall Street Journal. We improved quality that reduced manufacturing costs. I mean, we talked about this earlier, but you get the point, is that we have to be our own self-promoters because nobody's going to do it for us. There are a couple of other things that you can do with different types of results. So one of them is there are third-party inspectors out there. This is used quite frequently in the electronics industry, if some of you are on the call from electronics. But an example would be, you know, they go in and they won't necessarily maybe do process capability studies for you, but they certainly would go in and inspect for, you know, making sure that the safety and the, you know, the factory is clean and those types of things. So it's a useful tool. I didn't use them very much in my business career, but I know some other industries do. It's something at least can help mitigate some of the travel. The problem with third-party inspectors, at the end of the day, they never get blamed when you have a problem. You get blamed. So I'm not a big supporter of them, but it's another method. One that we did implement at Colgate was an international procurement office. We used that both to look for cost-effective goods to ship outside of the Asian market, as well as quality, and they basically handle it. The thing that they're local, many of them speak the languages, as you're familiar with, as well as know the cultural type of barriers you can run into. So they can be very helpful. We generated out of that particular office, I don't know how they're doing now, over $40 million in savings that more than paid for a lot of the value-added type of things that we talked about earlier. And lastly, there are some systems, we mentioned this earlier, that can help you monitor these types of things. They can, for example, there are systems that can keep track of at least public financials, daily alerts, and you can buy these from various providers on the outside. I think all these things, you know, can help you, you know, sell the value in what you're doing. Okay, the last one, I believe it's the last question here, and we'll, if you get a chance, you can even put some other questions in. Is that our supplier base is exploding. How do I influence purchasers to use contracts with preferred vendors? So I think this is talking about is sometimes, you know, people have biases in their departments, or when they send in potentially requisitions, they want to use their preferred vendor, or choose their vendors versus preferred vendors. Many times this happens, particularly on the indirect side. So there are a couple things you can do here. You can use, there are systems, I'm not, you know, saying Zycus is the only ones, but they have an AI system that we talked about earlier that you can leverage the information to help guide those requisitioners to a specific supplier, right? And I think that they're getting more and more sophisticated out there, so this is an easy way to do it. So when he tries to submit the request, it automatically puts them in there. Now sometimes this, you know, they may turn around and say, no, I have to have supplier B here. You know, so what I found, at least in my business-related type problems, I think first of all we need to educate the stakeholders about the why. Why do we use preferred vendors? And you know, I think you got to get the performance data out and take a look at it. You could say, look, we don't know anything about this new supplier, but we have these suppliers that have delivered on time and complete. They're very cost-effective and their quality's great. And why wouldn't we want to use those? Other parts of the business uses these people. Or his supplier is a poor quality. Maybe his supplier he likes because he delivers on time, but maybe he's costly. So you got to be able to do it. And I think you got to sell them on an ongoing basis around that. If they're not listening to you, what we did is we had a three-step process. The first one is we would say call the guy up and try to make the case why they should use the preferred, would not use the preferred supplier, or use the preferred supplier. We tell him verbally, we go through it, and hopefully he understood. You make sure he understood, and then if he did it again, maybe with a different grouping or whatever, we would actually send him a written email and tell him that, this is not acceptable. And then the third thing, which we very seldom use because this is not a way to influence and win friends, is we'd send a memo to his boss saying that the stakeholder was not being cooperative with preferred vendors. So, I think having an escalation type procedure is useful. Try to build trust with the stakeholder first, show them why, then if necessary, have a verbal discussion written, and then if necessary, go to the boss. I think all these three things, along with the information systems, basically guiding the people to the specific supplier, can basically be useful to make sure it gets to the preferred vendor. So with that, I think what we're going to do is just the last slide here is with the contacts. And you can see mine at Rutgers Business School here, and then there's Susan Lee at Zycus, as well as the marketing department. So if we didn't answer your questions, please feel either put them on the chat box down there, and I'll try to answer them the best of my ability. Or if you want to think about it a little bit, you have these contacts here. You can go ahead and basically send me an email or Zycus an email, and we'll do our best to try to answer your questions. So with that, I'll just leave it alone and wait a minute or so to see if there's any questions that come in. I think that there's a lot of good companies like, just the one I know, but there's others out there. Gartner, I think Hackett might do it. The first place I would go is to go to Gartner, Hackett, and see what they are recommending in those solution set. They'll give you 10 names, and they put them in all sorts of fancy 2x2 boxes. So, they put a lot of effort into it and interview a lot of people, so I think that's a starting point. The second thing I would do, and from a criteria standpoint, is find out and get reference of people who are actually using the system and go visit them and find out how it's working. And I think what you want to do is probably, maybe said this, I should have said this as first, but you want to have, what are you looking for in a system? I think, first of all, you'd say, look, here's the 5 or 6 things that I really need. I really need to track, supplier performance and KPIs and maybe risk management. But in addition to that, be flexible when you're looking at these systems because they have a lot to offer out there, things that you might not have even thought of, like this portal I mentioned earlier. And so as you go out and talk to, or get the report from Gartner or Hackett and get the, the information from the people you visit, you have maybe a longer list to evaluate. And then I would do like we always do. I would have, some sort of quantitative and qualitative method in evaluating all the different things. I would do the same thing like we do with our suppliers. You have a spreadsheet. Here's the things I think are important. I'd rate the suppliers to 1 to 10 on these 7 criteria that we agree is important, and then have a cross-functional team look at that and say, or maybe your experts and say, yep, supplier XYZ is the best one. And it can be a lot of different things, but I think I know I'm answering the question generally, but my idea would be that it might depend on the company, what they're looking for, what's a hot button to them. So hopefully it answers the question. That supplier automation, we've gone over this a couple of different times. If you can use supplier automation to free up your time and make you more efficient and effective, you can add a lot of value to the business and mitigate risk. So we went through many, many different type of questions, and I think if you have that system in there, you want to make sure you leverage that to be able to free up the time to be able to go after some of these, what I call value creation type of criteria. If you don't have it, you want to sell that to senior management that you think is a good idea. Don't wait around for somebody to tell you to do it. You can easily go start talking to your senior management to do it. And there are a lot of choices out there, and I would suggest to you that if you do this, you'll create a lot of value. Your company will do better. You'll have less problems out there around risk management particularly. You'll have better performing suppliers. And lastly, you as an individual will be doing a better job, and you'll be considered, I would think, to be able to look for bigger jobs in the future. So it's both a company deal as well as a plus for the individual. So with that, I'll just say if you do have any additional questions, just go ahead and email myself or Zycus. And with that, I'm going to go ahead and sign off.